Well, it ended up being a lot later start than I planned, but no big deal. It was it was nice. My buddy Miguel stopped over. Um, he's got a Regal, and we ended up talking a bunch, um, about things, and drinking some whiskey, going through that. So yeah, it was a good time. Um, but it pushed things a little bit back. So Miguel just got out of here, so I figured even if nobody's on because we're so late, um, I might as well sit down and still do the video. I'll give it a minute to see if anybody jumps on. I lowered the resolution on the video and changed a whole bunch of other settings in OBS, so hopefully we won't have the same issues as before. It's not going to look as great, but it'll at least, I think we'll be able to see everything versus last time where couldn't even see anything because the video was lagging so bad. Alright. Alright. Turn the record off. Alright. I don't think anybody's going to be jumping on, but that's alright. Obviously, this will be recorded and everybody can check in the next few days. If you do see it later, you have questions, comment, ask me. I'll follow up with answers to the questions from there. So as far as whiskey goes tonight, I'm drinking Wild Turkey Rare Breed. That's one of my absolute favorites. 116.8 proof though, so she's a chugger. Okay, so let's get into it. At the end of my last video, we actually had a whole bunch that got cut off. It was important things, but hopefully, the way that I kind of set it up, it was stuff that kind of flowed into this next piece. So last time we were really talking about the torque limiters, and at the very end we got to the torque tables, which were kind of our first, foray into the actual torque. So we're going to take that and we're going to follow that up with, okay, now you have these torque requests. We've learned how to kind of get rid of the limiters and what each of them does. So what do we need to do next? We need to make all of our torque calculations line up to allow our requests to actually be carried out the way we're asking them to be, okay? So I'll go back. I'm going to go back to the virtual dyno. Okay. And what we're going to look at is a graph of a bone stock tune. This is something that I went over at the end of the last video that didn't get recorded. I think the stream was just so bad at the end that it just shut me down. But this is what you're going to on almost every stock turbo stock tune graph. So a couple things to note here. This came out to 247 horsepower, 260 torque. at the wheels, this is very similar to what I always see. And if you remember from the calculations I talked about on how to calculate your driver demand tables in the last video, that actually the calculations when we, kind of wrote them all out, got us right back to in the 240 to 250 wheel horsepower range, which is exactly what you see we're making here. So the numbers do line up really nicely. A couple other things that I want to point out here though is the air fuel ratio and the boost curve. Okay, air fuel ratio being the biggest issue that I think is a major contributing factor to a lot of stock tune cars blowing up. So you'll see here that this takes a long time to get into power enrichment, and once it finally, then it goes way too rich toward redline into the low 11s. So what we really need to do is make sure we fix this area, and then boost, you'll see this weird kind of boost curve here, and you're going to see that boost curve is going to be different on every pool for every car. It's why you see some people saying they run 16, 18 pounds of boost stock. Some people say they run 13 pounds of boost stock. It's never consistent, and it's kind of a big problem. But we'll get to more of the air fuel ratio and things like that in the fueling discussion, but I just wanted to kind of point it out quickly right now. What I'm more concerned right now with is, again, the torque. Okay, so you can see the torque curve here. And then what I want to talk about is that if we go back to our last video, last discussion, what I talked about a lot was removing limiters. And the part that was cut off at the end is that a lot of tuning companies can very easily remove these limiters and make the car feel a lot faster, but the car is not going to be safe engine-wise, and it's not actually going to be that much faster. And a lot of times what I'm seeing is in our world with the GM PCM that we have, or multiple actually between years of models, but the Gen 5 PCMs, is a lot of the really good tuners came from V8 communities, right? And the big thing is, you just remove the limiters on an LS, and all you do is you take this same exact curve and you just shift it directly upwards, right? It's already, a V8 already has a flat torque curve, so if you just remove the torque limiters on that and do really nothing else, you can just shift that whole curve upward. Horsepower and torque just increase, at a fairly linear rate, and it's great. It's safe for the car. You freed it up. Things are great. If you do that same approach with this engine, turbo 4-cylinder, what you're going to end up with is something like this. Okay. Now, this is, I'm not trying to bash anybody. I didn't put, the name of this tuning company in here or anything like that. It's not my intention. My intent is just to caution everyone that a company very quickly can remove the torque limiters and create a graph that's like this, and you see plus 19 horsepower, 85 pounds of torque, and everybody will come to you and say, oh, it's torque that matters, and torques will move the car, and yada yada, right? I've never heard that in a 4-cylinder community in my life, but I really do believe it's because the people, because this is a GM platform. I believe many of the people came from these V8s, as well as the fact that these cars are offered. The Camaro chassis can come with a V8. The Cadillac chassis, you can get that with a twin turbo V6 that makes a ton of torque, and all of these things, right? I think that's a big part of the problem is the ideology behind how I want to make power on these cars is kind of skewed incorrectly toward making it act like the V8 version of the car versus utilizing all of the parts of. Okay, so what you're seeing here again, they're touting, 15 horsepower, 84 pounds of torque. You see this huge torque spike at the beginning, and then everything drops off quickly. That is not how I believe these cars should be tuned. That's not how I work on them. That's not how I believe these will last a long time, make a lot of power, anything like that. Okay, so instead, what we really want to do is we want to model this torque curve, not just release the or remove the limiters and let kind of the turbo and everything just do what it wants. We really want to massage this torque curve to be exactly what we want it to be. So what I want to bring up now is an example of a curve that I would much rather see. Okay, so this is a stock turbo car on the red line. This is a stock tune car. I'm so used to swapping out turbos and stuff now that it's always turbo is all I'm thinking about. So it's a stock tune car on the red line, and it is a E30-ish tune on the blue line. And the peak power obviously is greatly increased, but what I really wanted to pay attention to here or bring attention to is the difference in the curve and kind of what we're trying to accomplish here. Whereas on what I'm going to call the peaky torque V8 torque dyno curve here, you see this big hit and then a drop. What we're looking at now is instead we're taking and we're just trying to make as much area under. That's where you're going to have your best drivability, your best consistency, your fastest times, and your most reliability is if you focus on this area under the curve versus having a big. So I think that probably makes sense to everybody. So if you from stock at 261 pounds of torque at just over 4,000 RPM, and then that bumps up from 261 to 306 at a little bit higher RPM, but roughly similar. That's a 40, what are we looking at, 45 pounds of torque. So that's, again, roughly, so we've added roughly half the amount of torque that they're claiming here. Okay, so still very safe. 300 pounds of torque is very safe on the stock engine. But what we've done up here is now we're at over 320 horsepower up here, whereas at that same 6,000 RPM at 240, it's gone. So now we're in the 80 wheel horsepower range as far as our increase. So in the video with or in the dyno graph with the the real peaky number from the other place, they're talking about adding 85 pounds of torque, and I'm talking about adding 80 horsepower overall. And really that's done by expanding that area under the curve as much as you possibly can. So the next thing that I want to go into is kind of how we go about doing some of those things. So we'll get into a map again. And it looks like there's still some stuttering issues. I'm hoping, I'm hoping, guys, it might just be buffering. I'm hoping because things at least look a little bit different on my side this time. So maybe just pause the video for a little bit, let it buffer, and then start again. I'm not getting any of the same notifications of like dropped packages and images and things like that. So I'm hoping it'll come out a little better. I apologize. I'll keep doing everything that I can to get it to work. And worst case scenario, if we just can't get it to work, I'll just record these ahead of time and we'll go from there. All right. So the next thing that I wanted to show you guys was virtual torque tables. So the first thing we'll go to the torque model, and what you're going to see here is all of the actual torque coefficients, and you can see from my file compared to stock, basically every single table is changed in some way or another. These torque coefficients, it's important to understand that the virtual torque tables that we actually modify, that we'll be going into in a minute, all they do is give basically an easier, more real world examples of how to create these very complex coefficients. But these coefficients are what are used to calculate both your delivered torque and your requested torques. And that's where this gets into it's a really, in my opinion, anybody to, code in ECM like this. There's so many more direct ways that we could go about this, and why GM doesn't do it, I don't know. Very much overcomplicated just for the sake of overcomplicating it. Okay? But again, very important to understand that these coefficients are the numbers that are actually used by all of the torque calculations, both requests and delivered numbers. And then the way that we change those calculations, you can do it directly here. You could go in and just randomly change these numbers. I definitely don't recommend it. But the way that HP Tuners has allowed us to get a better idea of how to change those numbers is to use the virtual torque tables. So let me bring that up. So now we have our virtual torque tables that are up. Okay. Now, these as is. This is not very usable for us because our air mass needs to be raised because we'll see a lot more than 800 milligrams, and if we go to our map, we'll see a lot more than 100 kPa. So we'll have to change those a little bit. But what I wanted to do as an overview real quick is just to explain that you will have to change. If you want to do this torque modeling, you will have to change the air mass, the E85 air mass, and the E85 map. Okay, those will all need modifications, and you have this where every different combination of camshaft angles can also be changed. Now, you don't necessarily change every different camshaft angle. You can look at your logs, and based on where you're seeing issues, you can get to those cam angles and just change those in here. That is an option. it's a lot to go through every permutation of cam angles and change them all. Personally, though, that's what I do. I like them to kind of be as consistent as possible. So that's just, that's the way I go about it. So the thing that I want to do first as we get in here is we'll start with our air mass based. And I'm going to raise this up to 1600. Okay. And now you see on the left-hand side here, you have your spark value. So that's going to be, what we're seeing in these tables is the amount of torque, in a way, both requested and delivered or predicted for different spark values. So at negative 10 degrees, at 0 degrees, at 10, 20, so on. So what this is kind of saying is, at 10 degrees of spark advance, at 3200 RPM, the ECM is expecting 360 roughly pound-feet of torque. What I can tell you about these numbers is, and why I've been so kind of wishy-washy on exactly what they do. So I can tell you that these coefficients do play both into a limiter as far as limiting how much torque you can make at that level, but also it plays into kind of how much torque you should be making at that point. And I know that's a bit confusing. So if this was just a limiter and we wanted to get rid of this, and we said, okay, I increased my ability to make 5,000 RPM, so maybe, or 6,000, let's go with 6,000. So maybe that means you upgraded your turbo, you upgraded your fuel solution. Now at 1.2 or 1,200 milligrams, you can make 380 pounds of torque versus 330. These are, again, just random numbers that I throw in here. So you could come in here and you could then plug in your 380 pounds, and that's gonna you're basically your torque mine. What it's gonna do is it's going to try to very slowly or very inconspicuously limit. If you go back to some of the things that I talked about in the torque management, as far as you have some of these limiters that are like very intrusive, that slam the throttle shut, things like that. Once you're into modifying the virtual torque tables, you're getting into those limiters that you kind of can't figure out, where you're like, man, I should be making more power up here and I'm not, things like that. And what I do these virtual torque tables. Okay, so conventional knowledge originally was, and I'll flop back over screens here. Let me go to the logger. Okay, so originally conventional knowledge said, let's set up a histogram that's going to record our delivered torque, and then let's take our delivered torque and plop it into those virtual torque tables. Okay, so this, again, here's my my air mass based histogram. So this is just taking my delivered torque values and plotting them out on the histogram. And so you see this is saying, okay, hit 346 pounds at 4,000 RPM, 352 at 5,000, 316, 257, all the way to 205. So, a lot of people use that, and if your numbers are close, so if you don't have a very exotic setup and, a still stock turbo or a slightly larger bolt-on turbo, maybe getting into the, like the 20G and things like that. Going this route may work fairly well for you, and it may unlock some higher RPM power. But what I found through going with a much bigger turbo and really changing the entire possibility of the torque curve for the engine, these aren't actually, when you log delivered torque into here, it's not just logging actual delivered torque. It is going through all of those calculations and coming up with a number here. Okay, so what that means is that if I just take and copy those numbers and put them back into my virtual torque tables, nothing's ever really going to happen, especially for a larger turbo setup, because my torque curve that's been created in HP tuners is always going to be a curve that mimics what it thinks the stock turbo and stock engine can make, right? So it's going to be, I guess this way would probably be easier, but it's going to be a peak around 4,000 RPM, and then kind of hold that through 4,500, and then start really going downhill from 5,000 on and making little to no torque from 6,000 on. Okay, once you really change the way that the engine can make torque, so the way that it breathes, ideally we would just change the virtual VE tables, and based on knowing that our volumetric efficiency from 5,000 RPM on has drastically changed, ideally it would then back calculate that in here, but that's not what happens. So really what we have to do is we have to try to force these tables flatter torque, because now our bigger turbos and everything, they can make a flatter torque line. So I know this is really getting into the weeds, but hopefully it'll at least elicit some questions and I can answer them directly. But so what we've done here, if we look at the air mass calculation, if you go and you log your air mass for an entire pool, let's say you peak at this 1,400, and then you slowly go down and maybe you end at like 1,200 or so. What we're trying to do is we're taking this and we're trying to flatten these torque calculations out as much as possible. So we're saying, yep, okay, peak torque is going to be somewhere around, realistically, let's say between this 3,200 and 4,000. We want that to stay as close as possible. So you see it's kind of, dips here, but up here, okay, you're good. And then you're going to start dropping 357, 360, 335. So this is still a little bit better than stock, but not great. A lot of times from stock, what you'll see is, once you get to the 7,000 range, right here, you're going to be at like 200 pounds of torque, because with the factory turbo components and fueling components, you can't physically make, even if you said, hey, calculate 30 pounds of torque at 7,000 RPM, you can't physically do that on the factory components. So that's what we want to do as far as all of the virtual torque things. As soon as you can start moving more air, especially at higher RPM, you will need to come in here and you will need to raise and flatten your higher RPM values in here. And again, I want to reiterate, that is at all of your, at the air mass, map, E85 air mass, E85 map, and that's going to be for all your intake and exhaust cam angles. Okay. So that's where the virtual torque tables are used and how they're used. Highly suggest you, you do set up the histograms to log what you're seeing. Now, what I ended up doing is I set up my histograms to, let's see. So I set up my histogram to log what I'm doing as far as the delivered, but then I'll use virtual dyno to match up with this. So I'll take a log and I'll see, okay, my histogram says at 5,000 RPM, I'm making 352 pounds of torque. And I look at my virtual dyno and I'm making 352 pounds of torque. That's how I know my calculations are dead on where I need. But then if I look at 6 grand and my logged delivered torque is only 316, but in my virtual dyno, my torque is still carrying out past 6,000 and 7,000 RPM. That's how I know that I still need to flatten these values more. And I can guarantee you in this example, that would mean that here from 7,000 to 8,000 RPM, I need to go in at those values a lot more. So that would mean I need to go and I need to raise my 7,000 and 8,000 RPM and to 1,100 milligrams. I need to raise these up by a pretty significant percent, because let's say in my V or my actual dyno graph, I'm making, instead of 276 pounds of torque here, I'm making 350 pounds of torque. So then I want to go in here and I want to get this up as close as I can to that 350. Now what I will tell you is, because again, these were all designed to work on the same type of curve for a stock turbo, stock fueling, stock engine, these will fight you. These will really fight you. So if I go in and I just change, if I just change some of these things, and you go and you calculate your coefficients, which is how it calculates the original values that I showed, the torque coefficients, it's 4 right now, and I might as well. Let's see. If I make this 400 right now and calculate the coefficients, it will not stay at 400, if that makes sense. It's trying to stock curve until you can finally kind of break out of that. So it's less done on a smaller build. It's more of these changes that need done on a bigger build, because again, you're changing the ability to make torque and where in the RPM you can make torque, changing it completely from stock. So that's really how we use the virtual torque tables to both remove limits on our torque, but then also model how much torque we're expecting to make. That's how they work together. It's how much are you expecting, and then it kind of will impose a limiter right near that amount, how much you're expecting. All right. I know virtual torque tables are a lot. Torque coefficients are a lot, so I need to check for that one. Okay. So the next part of the torque modeling that I want to get into, and let's go back to our graphs. Again, when I say torque modeling, I'm specifically talking about really making this curve exactly how we want it to look. Okay, so instead of the big peak and down, broadening everything out. So a big thing that you can utilize to create that nice curve is your timing tables, so your timing advance. A lot of different thoughts on this, but what I will share with you that is pretty universally understood is, give me 1 second, we'll get to this one in a minute. Okay, so pretty universally understood that the stock timing tables are absolute garbage and a huge reason that these engines have issues. Okay, you do not want to see a timing table that has a peak amount of timing where your peak torque is. You never want to see that. Is absolutely asinine and absurd. Okay, so you'll see here, peak torque was around 4,000 RPM. Your timing is at 6 degrees from the factory, wide open throttle, 4,000 RPM, and I believe we were somewhere around 13.5 to 1 AF from the factory. You step on it, you get this huge torque hit, you have advanced timing and lean AFR, and people wonder why these cars have issues. Okay, now let's get to the second part of this. And while I believe this kind of peak torque entry point with the lean AFR and everything is something that causes issues over time, right? This is something that people don't talk about near enough, which is, now we're looking at red line basically, and we're down to 3 degrees of timing, and I have seen plenty of these that are at 0 degrees of timing or negative timing. The amount of heat that is created if you are running that kind of timing at full throttle at higher RPM, the EGTs, I can guarantee you, are beyond through the roof. The glowing manifolds that I've seen because of this is beyond me. This type of timing setup will ruin all your shit. So please, I do urge people, if you're gonna drive your car hard at all, please get at least some kind of tune, because this kind of stuff is absolutely insane. So instead of that, let's go to a more normal timing table. Now, this is a little bit exaggerated, this one, but I just wanted to show, be able to illustrate the example here. So, under normal situations, what you want is that you want your lowest amount of timing at your peak torque region, okay? That's when, let's say, your turbo is just hitting full steam, right? So that ramp is happening. So as that boost ramp is happening, that cylinder pressure is ramping up as well. And the last thing you want to do is increase that exponentially by having high ignition timing at that same time, okay? Or high timing advance. So what you want to have happen is you want, as your boost hits, comes in and hits full boost, you're getting into that peak torque area, you want your timing nice and low. Depending on the, a lot of times I'll start at literally 0 degrees advance and work up from there. Then you'll want to, and I've seen on these cars, somewhere around 6,500 RPM, 7,000. They don't make a lot of power for more timing after that, but they make a significantly amount more power from 5,500 to 6,500 from from your increase in timing. And there's a lot of different theory about exactly how much you should increase per cell, per timing cell, which is usually a couple hundred to 500 RPM between them. 1.5 to 2 degrees per 3 to 500 RPM will, all things being equal, give you the same amount of torque for every one of those RPM. There's a lot more that goes into it, but that's generally what you want to see if you're trying to get a nice flat torque curve. Okay, so again, nice slow increase, gradual increase linearly all the way up, versus the horrible stock timing table, which is starts out high and goes slowly downward, creating super high EGTs all the way to redline. Right? Okay, so that's more on how we're getting these nice big curves, area under the curve, nice gradual increases, gradual cylinder pressure increases, keeping the engines together, right? So you can see on the graph though that in this tuned version, peak boost here at 6,000 RPM actually isn't that much more, right? We've only risen from basically 18 to 19 psi. There's a lot more boost here, right? We've gone from 14.5 to 20 pounds. That's because in the stock setup, they're using lots of timing in this area to make torque. It's really bizarre that they would want to do that. Okay. Just to recap, first thing that we can do to start shaping our torque curve is our timing tables. We want them low timing at peak torque, gradually increasing toward around redline. Okay. On 93 octane cars, for the most part, 10 to 12 degrees is fine. 12 is a little on the high side depending on the setup and your area of the country, heat, and all those things. 10 degrees is definitely safe. Your 40 and above, you can definitely get into more like the 13 to 15 degrees. There's a lot of conversation about how crazy you can go with that. Plenty of people run up to 20 degrees of timing up top. I don't think you need to go that far, but that's just me personally. You can get on a dyno and always find where MBT is. Okay, so we had a little break in the stream, unfortunately. Man, I hope I can get this figured out. Anyway, we're going to go back to the editor. What I wanted to show was your wastegate duty cycle control can also very much help you get the full curve that you want and the feeling that you want as far as how boost comes in and all those things. All right, so we're going to go to our base duty cycle. And you're going to notice that the duty cycle table that I have here is very, very different than stock. Very different, okay? From stock, from the factory, The tune is extremely aggressive with the wastegate duty cycle. The reason they do that is because, remember back at the last video when I said the way this PCM, really models its torque and tries to make its power is it's all based on limiting. It's not based on working up to a limit, hitting a limit and riding the limit. Again, why I feel that these cars are so inconsistent and often feel like they're being held back the whole way. Okay, so what they're doing here is requesting a ton of wastegate duty cycle to make sure you hit your boost limits, your torque limits, your everything limits very quickly, and then ride those limits downward. You'll also notice here at the top your RPM goes from 1600 to 6900. You have the ability to modify this axis, and I definitely recommend people do this. It's not so necessary for turbo, but you can still get gains out of that and real control out of that. But with big turbos, it is very necessary. It's necessary because I give no shits what's happening below 2,000 RPM. I really don't care what's happening below 3,000 RPM, so I could even expand this resolution even more. But in this example, I've changed this to go from 2,000 to 7,000 RPM and giving me a little bit more resolution in the 4,500 to 6,000 range. And obviously you see these numbers are significantly lower than what they are from the factory. I do not use these numbers. They are examples to illustrate my point. But what I'm doing now is saying, okay, start with no wastegate duty cycle. And we know our target torque numbers based on, and our target boost numbers based on our driver demand tables and our boost limit table. So what's going to happen is we're going to start a little bit slower, and I promise you this does not affect spool in any meaningful way. We're going to start a little bit slower, and we're going to work up to our targets versus hitting our limits and pulling them back down the whole way. Okay? So highly people massage this table. This in conjunction with your driver demand can really give you the boost curve that you want to see. Okay? For my turbo specifically, like as an example, I don't want, with the S257, I don't want that turbo hitting my boost target of 24 pounds. I don't want it hitting that at 3,500 RPM. It's not what I want at all. It'll be way too much torque. I'm just not going to take it. It's not going to be the curve that I want. Okay, so I would start out something slow like this, and in your boost curve, what you're going to see is maybe I hit like 18 pounds at 4,000 RPM, and then I work my way up to 24 pounds by 7,000 RPM. That's going to give me the exact type of curve that's safe, repeatable, fun, delivers a lot of power, all those things. Okay. I may have an example of that for you guys. Let's see. I'm just trying to find the log. I have a good log. No, of how I got this. Okay, that'll be a good one. Then let me open up one to compare. I'm just going to show you guys how I massage the curves for my car. I know it's a much different it's a different setup than most. It's obviously a more exotic and a much bigger setup than most people will use, but I do think it's a good example of the power of all of these torque tables together and what you can kind of get them to do when you understand how they do all work together. Okay, I have my example. Let me pull that up. Let's get back to the graphs. Okay. So these are just two examples of my car, a couple different just iterations of maps that I've done. So what you can see in the blue graph is basically I had this what I consider is a little bit too spicy as far as the torque curve for my turbo. So this was over 400 foot-pounds of torque at 5,200 RPM, and then it kind of dropped off after that, right? What I did was kind of a two-part thing. I messed with my timing table. I brought the timing really down in the or down a lot further in the $5,000 to 5,500 range, and then I also removed some wastegate duty cycle from that area too, so that my boost kind of ramped in a little bit slower. Excuse me, or at least held lower longer until it kind of ramped up. So if you'll see here, we basically lowered on the red line. We lowered this boost in the 5,000 to 6,000 RPM range, and then it allowed it to come back up from 6,000 to 7,000 and beyond. And here it's only let's see, 20. So it's only 1.5 pounds of boost, but that coupled with lowering my timing area, that took me from this kind of big bump of 411 pounds of torque, and that then brought me all the way down to 363, and even moved that a little bit further to the right even, which is what I want to see. So just to give you an idea, that's how much of a difference can be made, and how kind of really granular and I feel it's almost artistic. This is my favorite part of tuning, is to really dial in curves the way that I want to see them. But these are the type of changes that you can make in the way that your car outputs power. Okay. All right. I think that may have been everything I was really going to go over tonight. There's a number of things that I could dive into. I can dive into the timetables. That could be a whole other session that we do. I could dive into the cam timing tables, so your variable cam timing, that is another one that can drastically affect your torque and power output. But is, you know, that could be its own thing. So we definitely have some that I could just pull out and do at least, you know, quick minutes or so on. But as far as an overview of the way that the virtual torque tables work, how they create those coefficients, and it's really just, you know, it's just a virtual way of looking at the data so that those coefficients can be created. The fact that the torque tables are not just something where you want to input your delivered and it's just going to follow that. You know, we went through that, which I think is very important. It's important to just know that you're kind of, it's a push-pull type of thing where you are not necessarily inputting just what the log is saying you're making in that torque curve, but you want to put in what you think your engine can make for the torque curve. And you do that push-pull a little bit, and eventually your engine starts, you see that it starts actually making, you know, the curve that you're looking for. And it's, you know, it's cool once those things all start working together. I did want to show one last thing related to that. Let me get to, okay. So this actually popped up a little bit earlier, but it was an accident. So unfortunately, I don't have the actual logs. I had to get a new computer a couple months ago. That's unfortunately why I'm on this shitty computer that can't stream as fast as I would like it to. But I did have these logs saved. So all I wanted to show was up top, you see a curve, right, that's still going like this. And now what you're looking at is the delivered torque and the immediate requested torque. So what you're going to see in the first graph is that typical kind of balloon shape. I make torque, you know, at 4 to 5,000 RPM. Then I start coming down. And what you'll see in the second graph is after all of my changes. Now this is on my car, so yours will not look exactly like this. But the second graph shows after all of my changes, now my my immediate requested torque and my delivered torque are now flat, much flatter than before. And what happens is now, instead of power starting to drop off at 6,000 RPM, my power is just continuing all the way through to red line. That's what you can expect once you dig into these tables and really get them all working together. Is you can expect that once that model gets changed from, you know, diving hard up top to kind of, you know, lifted back up flatter, you'll be freer to make that power up there. You know, as one last thing, just remember, on stock turbo, your curve is never going to be totally flat and look like my bottom map here. Your best case scenario for stock turbo is probably what you see in the top graph here, because it's a nice wide curve, but it does drop up top where you can't make any more torque up top anyway. So that's the last thing that I wanted to show. You know, I appreciate anybody who stayed up with me tonight. I know it was super late, and hopefully, you know, once this gets recorded and posted up, it won't be too bad as far as the lagging and things like that. Hopefully, everybody still gets a good grasp of what I'm talking about. this out of all of our discussions that I plan on doing, this definitely the one that is the most confusing, the most questions out there around the community about. It's the most technical probably, and I understand that people will probably have a lot of questions around it. I try my best to explain it in a way that everybody can understand, but these are very, some of these are very technical, kind of ideologies around how tuning, should happen. So any questions you have, please let me know. I will always get back to you, if not right away, at least the next day or some random ass time when I'm awake in the middle of the night. But yeah, appreciate it, everybody. I'm going to finish this up and probably go out to the garage and get some manifold welding done. So, see you guys later.